Gallay, which stands here. Antoine is a postdoctoral fellow this year at the Cohn Institute, joining Tamish and Neider, who continues their second year. Some could not come today, but I think most of you know her. Antoine's research focus on the practice of visualization in early modern natural, physical, and historical sciences. His background is from both directions. So he studies art history and cultural history in Lausanne and Edinburgh, and then had a Master of Philosophy in the History of Philosophy of Science in Cambridge. Last year, or this year, sorry, he obtained his PhD in art history and history of science, and not only in two subjects, but also in two universities, in Geneva and in Paris Nantes. His thesis focused on the interaction between artistic and scientific practice during Louis XIV's regime, through a close study of the career of the printmaker and polymath Sébastien Leclerc. And is currently investigating the way scholars and artisans interacted in early modern scientific circles and institutions, and we will hear more about it in the talk today. Yeah, I just also mentioned that he has already published 4 papers on related questions, and I leave the titles are in French, so I won't go into the translation. So I'll leave the floor to you, Antoine.
Thank you, but I have a problem. Maybe it's not the right place, but I tried here and it didn't work.
No, it should be. We are not sure about it. That's the problem. I guess this one, no?
Yeah, sure. Great.
In the view, where is the view? Okay, view. Full screen. I'll take. Better.
Okay, so firstly, I wish to thank Charles to let me introduce my research project, the research project I intend to work on here in the Cohn Institute. So this is obviously an ongoing project. There are still many issues and need for further evidences. So the conclusion that I will present here are only preliminary ones and are really open for further discussion. To put it very simply, the project aims at reconstructing the process of making pictures in early modern natural history, hoping that it might shed new light on changes in epistemic values that occurred during the 17th and 18th century. More precisely, what I'm interested in is the way the making of pictures could have been considered as an epistemic activity per se, and consequently that the draughtsmen and the engravers could have been considered as partly as genuine actor within scientific enterprises, and not just simply as Stephen Chapin famously coined invisible technicians. So this is a project which can be integrated within a very large and very rich historiographical trend with many important studies such as these essays collected by Brian Bagley in 1996 or Sachiko Kuzukawa's picturing the Book of Nature. Probably one of the most influential and certainly the most debated book related to the topic of scientific illustration is Lauren Daston and Peter Gallison's Objectivity. Through the study of pictures in atlases, Daston and Gallison have attempted to trace back the emergence of objectivity as one of the dominant epistemic virtues in modern science. So basically, they defend that objectivity was something that appears both conceptually and practically in the mid-19th century. Conceptually, thanks to Kant's new formulation of the problem regarding the relationship between our mental states and external reality, practically through the development of new means of mechanical reproduction, such as photography, which allows the individual to record, the man of science, to record phenomena objectively, that is, without having to interpret them first, without having to project his own ideas or preconceptions regarding the nature of these phenomena. So it means that objectivity or mechanical objectivity replaced another dominant epistemic virtue, which Daston and Gallison coined truth to nature, and which is a bit more difficult to apprehend nowadays. Contrarily to mechanical objectivity, where the scientist withdraws from the process of recording or reproducing phenomena, the truth to nature man of science willingly implies himself within the process. More precisely, his knowledge of the observed phenomena enables him to select what deserves to be represented, what deserves to be described, and to withdraw what does not need to be represented. In other words, in a truth to nature paradigm, the subjective projection informed by previous experiences is a crucial aspect of scientific enterprise, which leads us to a tricky question. Would it mean that the flaws of what we now call subjective projections were totally ignored, or totally unknown? Daston actually supports this view in a later article, a view that doesn't seem to match with the kind of discourse that, for example, Descartes or Malebranche developed on perception. But that is not a problem that I will talk about here. So let us just stick with Daston and Gallison thesis. The idea is precisely that mechanical objectivity became value because it was considered that subjective projection might actually be detrimental to the acquisition of knowledge. So in order to offer a preliminary example of their thesis, Daston and Gallison briefly described the way the British physicist Arthur Waddington attempted to reproduce the structure of drops. He progressively decided to change his method of recording the event, and he then acknowledged the value of the accidental and irregular appearances that he attempted to get rid earlier. I think this example does actually not work as well as Daston and Gallison suggest, but when summarized and presented this way, it's a very telling example, and that would be enough for us now, because what I'm actually concerned with is what happened much earlier. My point is indeed to discuss whether or not the epistemic values in the 18th century were so evenly shared. That is this truth to nature paradigm is so evenly shared by the many scientific actors. I don't simply want to nuance the reality of the truth to nature paradigm, which is something that can always be done with paradigms, so it's not very interesting to do so. what I would rather want to show is that when we use pictures as evidences for the emergence of objectivity, the entire thesis of the book does not work as well as they might have thought. In fact, Daston and Gallison's view is anchored into a certain conception of the relationship between men of science or natural philosophers and draughtsmen, craftsmen, engravers. Indeed, truth to nature conventions imply that the man of science actively contributes to the making of pictures. It seems possible to do so when the man of science is himself a draughtsman, when he was himself able to draw, like Galileo, like Robert Hooke, for example, the astronomer Johannes Hevelius, who even engraved himself the plates of his 1647 Selenographia. But these were absolutely exceptional situations. Most of the time, men of science could not draw at all. And even if they sometimes try to do, here is a telling example. Most of the time, they would finally think that it would be much better to rely on the expertise of professional draughtsmen or engravers. Now, this raises the problem of the way men of science who could not draw themselves interacted with draughtsmen and engravers during the making of pictures. What is generally told is that men of science did everything to control draughtsmen, to the extent that the draughtsman himself can only be considered as a kind of extension of the hand of the scientist. This view is indeed supported by the social-cultural context of early modern Europe. Let us remember that in the 17th century, normal painters, not exceptional painters, but the normal painter, the normal draughtsman, normal engraver was still mostly considered as craftsmen and thus belong to one of the lowest classes of society. At least in ancient regime France, which is the most exemplary social system in the early modern Europe, probably. On the opposite, men of science generally belonged to the highest classes of the third estate, or were even members of the aristocracy or of the clergy. There was thus a significant social hierarchy between the men of science and the draughtsmen, which could have implicitly dictated the way they interacted. This hierarchy would have been so strong that craftsmen would have remained invisible technicians. That is basically the thesis of Simon Shapin, even if it's in another context than ancient regime France. So craftsmen would have remained invisible technicians in the making of early modern science, the invisible hands of the visible minds of men of science. So recent studies on the relationship between craftsmen and men of science actually led to nuance many aspects of this view. However, when it comes to draughtsmen or engravers, this hierarchical difference is still strongly emphasized by historians. And it indeed supports Daston and Gallison's thesis. It is both socially and epistemically acceptable that men of science control draughtsmen. However, what I intend to show is that the situation between men of science and draughtsmen can be much more nuanced than what is generally said, and it can be nuanced to the extent that it might actually impair the validity of Daston and Gallison's thesis. I'm not sure about the fact that it will totally impair their thesis, but it might be a real obstacle. So it might offer another view of the way the epistemic values conveyed by the making of pictures were allocated during the early modern period. To do so, I will focus on a very specific kind of pictures representing the anatomy of various animals in a very specific context, that is the French Royal Academy of Sciences during the second half of the 17th century. Indeed, this context will allow me to emphasize significant changes that have been hitherto unnoticed in the way pictures were made. So to begin with a kind of striking example, here are two pictures of barefoot, both having been made after real barefoot. So this is drawing after nature per se. As you can see, the difference is immediately striking, and it is obviously not only due to the difference in medium, because the left one is actually not drawing, it's a print or etching to be more precise, and the other one is a drawing made with black chalk and red chalk. So comparing these two pictures is always a very delicate task, which raises a lot of methodological or even epistemological or even ontological issues. So I will not be careful at all at this stage. I will just assert that there is little doubt that the image, that the drawing on the right is more realistic than the print, meaning that the resemblance between Simoneau's figure and the real barefoot is higher than the resemblance between Leclerc's figure and the real barefoot. In other words, it is very likely that Simoneau's representation is closer to the model it has been drawn after than Leclerc's one. So what were the reasons for such differences? Which these are two pictures that are made barely in the same context. So I will come back later to that. So what were the reasons for such differences? What I will suggest is that it was precisely due to the differences in the way men of science collaborated with draughtsmen and engravers. So I will firstly investigate the way the draughtsman and engraver Sébastien Leclerc works with the academician Claude Perrault, who was the unofficial leader of the research project on animal anatomy in the French Academy of Sciences. I will then focus on the role played by another anatomist, Joseph Guichard-Duvernay, which first worked with Leclerc and Perrault, and then after the latter step, took over the animal project and stopped working with Leclerc in order to collaborate with two other draughtsmen, Louis de Châtillon and Philippe Simoneau. So Leclerc's figures are actually a detail of one of the lavish plates made for the most important book of the young Academy, the Mémoire pour servir à l'histoire naturelle des animaux, whose first volume was published in 1671. This book was first and foremost an instrument of prestige, a part of a larger project conceived by Jean-Baptiste Colbert in order to spread the image of Louis XIV as the most magnificent sovereign ever. But this purpose did not conflict with the scientific ambitions of the authors of the book. In fact, those have been exceedingly careful about several epistemological issues. They stressed the importance of autopsia instead of relying on previous commentaries. They chose also to focus on specimens instead of types in order to be able to discuss the way species were organized. And they were also very careful about the making of pictures. Indeed, these were made directly after nature during the dissections that took place in the King's Library. And moreover, as the author explained in the preface of the book, one deemed that it was very advantageous for the perfection of the figures that these were made by a hand which was driven by another knowledge than just the knowledge of painting, since the latter was not enough, because the most important thing is not to represent correctly what one sees, but to see correctly what wants to represent. So the latter sentence, this sentence is probably among the best evidences that could support Lauren Daston and Peter Gallison's truth to nature paradigm. An expert in animal anatomy would produce better pictures than a professional draughtsman, since he knew what should be represented and what should not be represented, as we will see. In this case, such a claim was not an empty word. It was a very serious statement about the way things were actually done, because indeed it was Claude Perrault himself, so the anatomist in charge of the animal project, who made the drawings during the dissections. So Perrault was undoubtedly a very good draughtsman, and his architectural drawings were widely praised during his life. So here we are in the very peculiar case where a man of science was generally able to draw like Galileo or Hooke. However, when we begin to dig a little and to try to understand how the pictures were actually made, how Leclerc engraved his plate, it became much more complicated. In fact, Perrault had a lot of things to do during the dissections. While he did not dissect himself, he had to supervise the academicians who were in charge of dissection, and he also had to write down what he observed. Actually, most of the drawings he made after nature were simply sketches that enabled him to describe things quickly and precisely, at least more quickly and more precisely than he could have done with language only. So here are two examples, two figures of the reproductive organs of a hedgehog. It seems that the figure in the left was quickly delineated after nature, and that the right one is simply a copy that Perrault later made. In this copy, he was a little more careful, and he used some shadowing, either by enlarging some of the lines, some of the lines, or by adding hatching. But it is worth noting that when he did this copy, he could not have seen anymore the organ. Let us remember that dissections had to be made very quickly. It was a very dirty job. Animals were often dead, often died several days before the dissection, so the inside were probably partly rotten. So when he did the second drawing, Perrault was working only on the basis of what he saw in the first, what he could see in the first sketch he did, and of course what he memorized about what he saw during the dissection. Such drawings were actually used by Leclerc in order to engrave the plates of the Mémoire au sérieux Histoire naturelle des animaux. Here in the plate of the hedgehog, you can actually recognize the reproductive organs. So here Leclerc had to recreate an entire very similar three-dimensional figure by adding shadows where they should have been. Another example enables us to see more clearly the way Leclerc had to work. Perrault had made a sketch of the hepatic organs of a bustard. It might have been drawn after nature because it's quite crude, but it's likely that it has been then corrected since the liver was progressively enlarged. Oh yeah, So the liver has been progressively enlarged, and actually we know that Perrault dissected 6 specimens, so probably he saw the size of the liver in every specimen, and finally judged that the liver should have this size. So actually, once again, it really well exemplifies Laurent Daston and Peter Gyson's truth to nature paradigm, because the philosopher, the naturalist, the man of science is doing the choice to represent what the things, the objects, the way they should be represented. So then Perrault apparently arranged the different organs as they should be represented in the plate. Leclerc thus had to follow these indications. He obviously had access to other drawings, and maybe Perrault provided him with other indications. But what is striking is that Leclerc never saw the real organs he was engraving. He was not permitted to attend the meeting where the academicians dissected the animals, so he only had Perrault's various sketches and information, and he had, on this basis, to reconstruct these kind of very similar figures on the basis. So he never saw actually what he represented. He just had several different sketches that he had to on the basis of which he had to reconstruct the figure of the various organs. So this practice might have raised some issues. For example, for the external appearance of the harbor seal, Leclerc apparently had to rely on this sketch by Perrault, and he added a lot of different elements, for example, the regular spots, the dots on the back of the animal, the eye, which looks like a human eye, and the kind of musculature that we can see in the forelegs that absolutely no harbor seal ever had, probably. Here the pictures contradict what Perrault wrote in the memoir, because he actually also Leclerc actually also represented the forelegs of the seal like kind of little hands, while Perrault wrote that both forelegs and hind legs were more adequate for swimming than for walking, which obviously refers to the similarity between the seal's legs and flippers. So in this case, it seems that Leclerc had clearly not enough information and that he had to invent, to project what he thought would be correct. In fact, Leclerc always had limited visual information regarding what he should draw because of the nature of the sketches, which led him to do actually very little work on the texture of the organ themselves. The archives of the Academie of Sciences only retain one single preparatory drawing for the plates, which will be engraved, but you can see that every organ is really well shaped, very round, very smooth, and this aspect was due to the fact that actually Leclerc had to work with very limited information and do a kind of reconstruction. So we can suggest, if we follow Daston and Gyson's thesis, that it was precisely what Perrault and the other members of the Academie wanted, this kind of very well delineated aspect, where everything is simple and can be easily recognized and identified. The problem is that it seems at this very moment that not everybody in the Academie was actually happy with this kind of result, as we will see in the case of Joseph Richard Duvernay. So Duvernay joined the Academie in 1676. He was already very famous at this time, but he was only 28 when Perrault was actually 63. So it was Perrault was undoubtedly the leading figure at this time for anatomical research. So it is very likely that there was a very important hierarchy between Duvernay and Perrault when Duvernay arrived in 1676. So during the meetings, Duvernay had to dissect under the supervision of Perrault, who continued to work as usual and to do his drawing himself. But things will change. Will change in the beginning of the 1680s, and especially in 1683, when an extraordinary animal died, and the academician proceeded to dissect in front of the king himself. It was an elephant, and it was to be brought within the king's library, where dissections usually took place. So it was taken to the king's garden, which was not the garden of one of the king's castle, but a specific institution whose primary task was to grow medicinal plants. So it was then decided that the skeleton of this elephant that was dissected would be retained in the king's garden and not in the Academy. Actually, the skeleton is still in the Museum of National History in Paris. Another skeleton, this time of a crocodile, was then brought to the same place, so in the King's Garden. And on the 3rd of February 1683, it was decided that Perrault, de la Hire, and Duvernay will gather with Monsieur Leclerc in order to engrave the skeletons of the elephants and of the crocodile. So actually, for the first time, as far as we can say, Leclerc was invited to draw directly after the real specimen, and not just to engrave after Perrault's sketches. What I suggest is that Leclerc's contribution was encouraged by Duvernay himself. Indeed, for the first time also at this moment, Duvernay had a specific power over Perrault since he had been appointed professor of anatomy in the King's Garden. So for the first time, he was not anymore Perrault's unofficial assistant, but someone who was in charge and who could have legitimately required Leclerc's contribution. The figures engraved after Leclerc's drawings are very different from what we have hitherto seen, and notably, if you look at both skulls, they are exceedingly detailed, and they clearly contrast with the smooth aspects of the organs that we can still see and that were probably also engraved after Perrault's drawing. So what I want to suggest here is that Duvernay was unhappy with Perrault's work and that he wanted more detailed drawing, and that it is why he asked Leclerc to come with them and draw himself the skeleton of the elephant. But there is no evidence that things really happen like that. However, there is an evidence in another context that supports this hypothesis. At a certain point, there was a disagreement between Perrault and Duvernay about the way pictures should be made. Only a week after the visit of the King's Garden in order to draw the skeleton of the elephant and the crocodile, Perrault presented to the Académie several plates engraved by Leclerc and was then requested to do a memoir for the impression of a second book, that is, in fact, the third volume of the history of animals, for the correction of the old plates and the engraving of the new ones. So there was suddenly a question about the correction of the plates that have been made for the Mémoire conservée à l'histoire naturelle des animaux. So we know that these corrections were notably about the size. Maybe I won't enter the details here, but basically the copper plates had to be cut partly, and then the borders had to be engraved again. But those corrections also imply the change of certain organs. These organs was replaced in the same copper plate. So the copper plate was, the part of the copper plate was erased and engraved again with other figures. So we know that there have been modifications like that, which doesn't say a lot about the way pictures were actually made and the choices that were made for the pictures. But we have also evidences that actually some figures were just engraved again, not because Perrault, not because the academician wanted another figure, another organ, but because they wanted another kind of pictures. And this is the case with the eyes of this bird, the cassowary, where you can see that they do not change the organs themselves, they change the way the organs should be represented. And what we see and what we know is that actually this was not Perrault's choice, because there are preparatory drawings for these new figures which bear a little note by Perrault's hand, which states that ces figures ne valent rien, these figures are worthless. So actually, what happened here is that Duvernay was able to convince the rest of the academicians that against Perrault's choice, the figures should be made in order this way. So this change was made against Perrault's will, and there was only one other member of the Academy at this time who would have required such a change, and it was Duvernay. What is important here is that most of the other members of the Academy supported this view against Perrault. So it means that the academicians acknowledged that there was some flaws in the figures engraved by Leclerc after Perrault's drawing, and that the drawings after nature made by professional engravers, either Leclerc or Chatillon, would be a better basis for engraving. So again, you can see in this plate that some of the organs were removed in order to put another figure which is so detailed that actually could have never been made after Perrault's sketches. It was necessarily made after a professional draughtsman figures. Time is going to be, I'll try to be short. So there are other strong evidences of the new implication of draughtsmen in the Academy. In 1685, for the first time, the account of the King's Building, that is the ministry which was in charge, among many other things, of the Academy's budget, referred to payment made to Leclerc and Chatillon for anatomical drawings. We even know that during this year, Chatillon actually spent 16 days in the Academy to draw anatomical parts of various animals. And a year later, Chatillon received a yearly salary of 400 livres tournois just to produce drawing of plants and animals. So there is no doubt that at this time, draughtsmen became involved in drawing after nature against Perrault's will. So the truth to nature paradigm here seems more difficult to defend. At the beginning, the members of the Academy thought it was a good thing that an expert in anatomy was also the draughtsman, since his knowledge would be useless to select, would be useful, to select what has to be represented. But then this method revealed some of its flaws, and it seems that Duvernay was able to defend another method which relies on the professional draughtsman's ability to represent things as he sees them and not as he thinks they really are. So this method might actually be quite close from mechanical objectivity in the sense that its purpose might have precisely been to prevent the man of science to interfere with the production of pictures in order to avoid what would have been considered as subjective projection. Indeed, there is clear evidence that such a view was perfectly conceivable in the late 17th century. This is a 1686 letter by the famous Dutch microscopist, Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, which states, in order to place before your honor's eyes the making of an unborn shrimp, I have taken several of the same from the eggs and placed 4 of these before my microscope, and had the draughtsman come to my house and instructed the same draughtsman to follow the figure as it appeared to him as closely as possible without my wanting to tell him that he was drawing. So the draughtsman didn't know what he was supposed to draw. He just guessed, I don't know what I'm drawing, but it seems to me that it is a shrimp. So while mechanical means of reproduction such as photography were not yet available, there was already the desire opposed to truth to nature, that is a desire to limit the projection of knowledge onto the picture in order to have a picture of the thing as it appears and not necessarily as it really is in the mind of the man of science. The case of Duvernay is more ambiguous, but I'm afraid I have no time to really deal with that. What I just want to...
You have a few more minutes.
Yeah, a few more minutes would be enough to conclude. But basically, what I wanted to show with Leeuwenhoek is that it is possible, actually, that people in the late 17th century...
You can have 10 more minutes if you need to.
10 more minutes.
To complete the overview.
I'll go quickly with Duvernay. But basically, Duvernay, we have a lot of information about the way Duvernay worked with his draughtsmen, because notably for this book project on the reproductive organs of a snail, which is a very precise topic, all the preparatory plates and drawings were have several notes which are actually requests for correction. So we know that Duvernay was really much involved within the process of within the making of picture, but not within the process of drawing after nature. He was trying to correct and to control draughtsmen, but once the drawings were made, and not during the time the pictures were made, which was the case of Perrault, who was doing pictures himself. So, but again, I cannot really enter. It's a bit too long. What I will. So what is interesting is that the way Duvernay let his draughtsmen work suggests that he could have expected them to record aspects that he himself would have not necessarily considered useful. Here, the distinction between Perrault and him is striking. Perrault wants pictures that show what he describes, that can be readable, easily readable, and that can support his description. Duvernay wants pictures that can be used as substitutes for real specimens, that could present aspects that were not yet understood, but that could later eventually be understood thanks to these pictures. So the differences regarding the very function of pictures might be well exemplified by this other comparison between the figure of the chest of an ostrich in the right, so it's always Leclerc's engraving for the Mémoire pour servir à l'histoire naturelle des animaux, and a drawing by Chatillon, also of the chest of an ostrich, from another slightly different point of view. But you can see that in Leclerc's print, everything is represented distinctly. Everything is identified as a meaning. In Chatillon's drawing, on the opposite, things were kind of blurred. They were not a priori distinguished one from the other. In fact, the figure displays a lot of visual information that remain unidentified and are thus open for further research. So this comparison was actually acknowledged, was made in the early 18th century, where the superiority of Chatillon's drawings over Leclerc's print was clearly acknowledged. And this might be, I won't read that, but you can do it. This might be a judgment based on the result of the picture, so the kind of distinction that we can observe here, but it can be also the result of the process of the difference in terms of the process of making a picture. And actually, a bit later, the naturalist Antoine Portal claimed in an article about female reproductive organs that the painters often see better than the anatomists. So it is actually, so this kind of evidences suggest that something might have happened at some point, maybe in the late century, maybe in the late 17th century, maybe earlier, that led to change in some epistemic virtues, a change that does not fit within Daston and Gallison's discourse. My preliminary ideas here are that actually the emergence of objectivity was something that does not come after truth to nature. On the contrary, I think that we should rather seek for the moment where scientists actually became aware of the most fundamental issue, one of the most fundamental issues in scientific practice, that is the recognition of the difficult balance between the benefits of objectivist practices and the benefits brought by subjectivist practices, which is something that Daston and Gallison would have, according to them, would have happened even later in the 20th century with the third paradigm, they call trained judgment. So those are obviously very open hypotheses that are very disputable and for which more evidence should be gathered. What I wanted to tell, to conclude, is the question which directly leads the way, which directly follows the way Duvernay gave to his draughtsmen more power in the making of pictures, is to what extent the fact that draughtsmen could draw after nature and be kind of autonomous in the production of pictures, to what extent to what extent the making of drawings by professional draughtsmen was a way to gain new knowledge, and to what extent the draughtsman's ability to observe and to memorize what he saw could have been acknowledged and valued by men of science themselves. And I just a little example of this kind of recognition of the value of draughtsmen, which is in a very different context, is in a small, in a little treatise on numismatique, where the scholar César Baudelot de Derval tells how the legend of an ancient medal was discovered thanks to Franz Ertinger, an engraver that was in charge of reproducing medals by print. So it says the legend is almost erased, and without Mr. Ertinger's marvelous sagacity to unearth the most difficult things from our medals, I would have been content with the first letter I see there, which began the word autocrator, blah, 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 but I must not hesitate any longer, since he himself certainly reads out Carlassian Sebastian. In such a case, not only the engraver, Franz Ertinger, really produced new knowledge, but this contribution was clearly recognized and valued by the scholar himself. He was not anymore a kind of invisible technician, but someone whose specific skills made him a valuable actor in the process of knowledge making. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antoine. Christian?
Thank you for your talk. I was very happy to see these materials. Still digesting basically the overall thrust of your argument. But, I have a question about a term that I think is in your talk but not explicitly mentioned. So you were talking about, on one hand, truth to nature, also according to Nelson, consists of 3 points. It's knowledge, scientific knowledge that helps you to select what you need to portray. It's also painterly technique that concerns the accuracy of the visual representation of that. Well, there's a third element, and that's smart, which is connected with the ability to see the shape in the sense of the angles, right? The ideal shape. And I think these 3 components come together in Destin's description of truth to nature. So it's not an identical object. It's not also just about scientific knowledge. It's also about sort of this older paradigm, which goes back to Renaissance, of imitation of nature, which you achieve also through art. So that's the first question. How does art come into your story? Because you were also saying that, for example, about painters see best. And I think that didn't just concern, the accuracy or the technique of craft, but really this ability to see what matters, to see the angles, to see the time. But that's just my suggestion. Maybe you can expand that. Second question. I got a little bit confused about what you said regarding objectivity. And I know that Destin and Ellison say, well, of course, in a very narrow sense, we nowadays take objectivity to be mechanical objectivity. But their story is that truth to nature is at least as legitimate a form of objectivity as all the others. They say objectivity is actually, this is what turns out, right, in this book, a subcategory of the history of subjectivity. So it's always about controlling or sort of coming up with what they term epistemic virtues to enable the subject to represent something objectively. And mechanical objectivity is one idea of that, but in the 17th century or also the 18th century, the idea of truth to nature was also a form of objectivity. The virtues are different. The virtues are precisely that you have to have knowledge, you have to have craft, you have to have art in order to extract an idealized mind, as opposed to mechanical objectivity where your epistemic virtue is to keep yourself out of the process. But I think in their story, they don't say objectivity starts with mechanical objectivity. Their story is, I think, that we have just come to understand sort of this 19th century idea of objectivity and have taken it in parts of the total. But I'm not sure that they would, go against what you want to say, that sort of there is earlier origins for objectivity, and I think that works quite well. So that's the second, I guess, remark. But the first question was how does the art figure into
thank you very much for two very interesting questions. But so for the first one, I don't really know what a 18th century, late 17th century, 18th century scholar really expect from a draughtsman. I think that we should be very careful not to project the kind of the view that we might have, and that some people in the Renaissance and early modern period might also have about painters as geniuses that were able to see things in a kind of Neoplatonician way that could see things beyond. But here we are talking about very common draughtsmen. I mean, Leclerc is maybe more important. I mean, a kind of important figure. I like him because I did my thesis on him, but he was an important figure, but he was far from being a kind of universal genius that was able to see things beyond the appearances. This kind of the form in an Aristotelian way. So what I think scholars are men of science are dealing with when they are working with draughtsmen is simply what I said. So I in your view, I maybe this is a reductive, maybe a reductive view that is basically men of science are concerned with the question whether draughtsmen and then themselves project things that are actually not there when they are representing stuff. And that's the main question. I cannot really think. I can. You tell me if I understand if I understood correctly your point, but I cannot really believe that the common men of science in the 18th century had a view of the common, about the common draughtsman in the same time, that the draughtsman was able to have a specific ability that that was connected to his status as an artist. Even in terms of artist, it's from it.
But I think, well, maybe we should consider this as a co-production. I mean, this is not an individual agents. I mean, that the end result, of course, is, I mean, drawer is the technician, right? Because this is that they have the technique, they have the craft, and the scholar has the scientific view, so he can assert, what matters, what doesn't matter, and he also has, an end of matters, and as sort of an normal size, sort of inventiveness, imagination, creativeness, and all these things combined.
Yeah, but so there is no real reason that the scholars see a certain ability in the draughtsman beyond the technical ability. So that's my point, and that's where maybe we disagree. But maybe maybe we'll discuss that later. I'll be happy to. And I just answer to your try to answer to your second question about objectivity. I think Daston and Gallay actually struggle with this term of objectivity, and that they kind of mix. They are at some point they are a little essentialist, meaning that the word objectivity means the opposite, meant the opposite in the 17th century that means now. So it's the evidence that things were totally different than they are now. But at other points they are a bit more nominalist, and I would favor this kind of approach. So when I'm using objectivity and subjectivity, it's more kind of projection of our own concepts, which is something that doesn't get some do. But when they talk about truth to nature, you have to choose. Either you use objectivity as a concept, as we know use it, and in this case, truth to nature cannot be something that fits with objectivity as we know consider it, or either you can be more flexible maybe with the word, but I have the feeling that we'll lose some attempt. I don't mean that I don't want to mean that I succeeded in clarifying stuff, but I have the feeling that if we use objectivity and subjectivity in the way we use them now, we can try to understand how during different periods, during different times, people try to navigate with how things come to them and how they come to things, or at least how they project what they know, what they think they know onto the object. But maybe, yeah, that's a very tricky subject. I have no definite answer at all on this, but I'll be happy to discuss that. Sure.
No, yeah, that's one that I think that there is also, if I understood correctly, the question is also historical one. So it's not only the question whether what is objectivity, but whether if if much I remember from the book of Galliston and Aston, they claim that truth to nature continued much longer than what Antoine showed here. So that's one point. I'll go by the order I open. Ido?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm not sure, but if I understood correctly, you suggested that the agency of the draft changes. And with that, I'm not sure I'm convinced with what we've seen here, because I could interpret it as you have two commissioners, and then I forget his name, but quote-unquote commissioners who have diverging ideas of what is important to show. And in that sense, I still don't see a difference in the agency of the draftsman. Claude Parole comes from these ABC is important to show, and it doesn't have to be correct to what is really seen, and then there's a different attitude or belief later on. And so, but I don't think that from this evidence we can see a change in the agency of the draftsman. The other thing that interests me is, I mean, from what shown, what is interesting is that change itself. But the question for me then is, can we see that change in other types of drawings? Let's say of plants or other elements, or even in architecture, in order to prove a shift in a paradigm or something. Because if it's only that, these two examples, then I can also suggest that it's the personal, let's say, beliefs of these two commissioners. And maybe Claude Parole, another thing that I find interesting is to try and understand if his understanding of, I mean, he was also a prolific draftsman by himself in his education, you know, he's an architect. Does his perception of architecture influence how he perceives, let's say, anatomy? So,
yeah, well, thank you very much. So I'm absolutely not sure that there is a change in paradigm here. I think that we have previous examples of draughtsmen or engravers that are valued in a way which is very close to what Duvernay will do with his own draughtsmen. But what is interesting is that it's not only about Hérault's and Duvernay's choices; it's all it's about the Academie's choices. I mean, they are not just two guys that one does his stuff and the other follows him and then suddenly was able to do something different. I mean, it still represents the change that I observed, still says something about the changes that were shared by the whole Academy. But so probably not everybody. I mean, it's still very little. I mean, it's kind of. I agree that it's far from being perfect, and it doesn't really tell a lot about a kind of bigger change, change of paradigm or whatever. But it tells something about a change within the Academy. Let's say that, and it might tell something larger if it is supported by other examples. But you're absolutely right. There are, for example, at the same time, the drawings made by Nicolas Robert and Abraham Boss, the drawing of plants within the Academy. Those two draughtsmen have a lot of freedom, like Duvernay's draughtsman, sorry. So we might expect it works the same way, but actually these draughtsmen, Abraham Boss and Nicolas Robert, were criticized for their drawing precisely because they project too many stuff and they do things that the academicians considered as flaws. So it has to be. It's the kind of limits of microhistory that cannot indeed attest a real change that would take place in all Europe, but at least it tells something not only about Duvernay and Perrault's individual choices, it tells something about the way things changed in the Academy. So that's maybe the balance that I could find on maybe between your criticism, which is right, and my ambitions, which are probably a bit too high for the moment.
Sorry, I wasn't criticized.
No, but it was a very good point. I totally agree with that. It's not a perfect example. And even the fact that Perrault was himself a draughtsman, I mean, it complicates everything, but it just tells that there is a change within the Academy. So that's maybe what I hope to have succeeded in demonstrating here. Sheila?
Thank you for the beautiful presentation. I really appreciate your efforts to shed light on the craftsmen and illustrators. And I wonder, and if you can reply, whether it also a milestone or a point of change for the anatomists of future generations of French anatomists, that where there is kind of a division of labor and other illustrators, and they should be focusing on the more literary descriptions rather than the artistic one. But it had some impact on their training or on their sketchbook, you know. So what does it do to the art of making science from the point of view of the anatomy?
Okay. If I understood correctly, the question is about how this kind of change that we observe here could reflect on perhaps a change in the way anatomists practice and see themselves. That's okay. That's a very good question. I have no precise answer. I mean, if we take the example of Perrault and Duvernay, there are striking differences, but I don't know. I don't think they are really representative. I mean, Perrault is a kind of universal man. He wants to do most everything. And Duvernay is closer. Is a very close. I mean, is an example of something very close to the actual scientist. I mean, he has a subject in mind, and he like this book on this project, which was supposed to be an entire book on the reproductive organs of snails. So he wants to go really deep into the subject. So, but it again, I have no. I don't think it reflects a change, but maybe what could be said, and which could echo what you said, this change that we observe here in the making of pictures is also due to their different different attitudes of each of these two actors, the fact that they are very different one from the other in terms of scientific ambitions, social ambitions also. But still, it's we could dig on the way the Academy itself perceives anatomists and how maybe they change. But we know that in the beginning of the Academy there was no precise, except the difference between physicians and mathematicians. There is no precise categories. While in the 1699 rules, sorry,
reorganization.
there is a reorganization, yeah, and where categories like anatomists, botanists, mechanicians were clearly stated. So, but yeah, I have no precise answer on that.
Right.
Short. The first, we can draw some sort of analogy between the works of the draughtsmen and photographers.
The work of
Typographers.
ah, okay.
Text.
Yeah.
Letters
Mm-hmm.
and fonts. I'll show you. Show me. Sorry. So basically, the work of draughtsmen and the works of typographers as agents of active agents in the creation of scientific knowledge or just knowledge. So that is natural. So, because John Dee talked about his typographer as the typographical parent of his work, the Monastir. So already in the late 16th century, there was an acknowledgement of the works of typographers as craftsmen who provide essential work. So basically, so this is the first question. The second question: are you familiar with the works of William Ashworth and thesis about the emblematic worldview? So, do you think your thesis enters the compartment of the eclipse of the emblematic worldview? Because it's all just natural, natural history without a metaphysical, theological, or spiritual aspect, and Van Leeuwenhoek was a crypto Kabbalist or some sort of question about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. For the first question, it's difficult to tell you something which would really go into the direction of Oreopos. What we know is that in the Academy at this time there was a huge attention to typography, and notably because there was a creation of new types. I think it's the Grand Jean, and there was a lot of works going on typography. But does it mean that that scholars themselves would have been careful about the question of typography for their own work? I don't know. I think the parallel is limited because typography is mostly about it's mostly rhetorical or ornamental choices. It's
a visual aspect of the text.
Yeah, it's a visual aspect of the text, but of course, but it doesn't refer to natural to the natural. I mean, when you talk about, let's say, animals again. Yeah, that would be another topic. Of course, I have no everything which is in between diagrams and this kind of stuff, which are actually in between the kind of pictures that we saw here and typography in some way. But what I think the awareness is still the questions that scholars would consider are still different than the kind of questions that they have regarding pictures in this case. I think that it would be mostly, there are a lot of questions about typography and for example, copper engraving for diagrams, which is something completely useless in some way, but it gives like better types gives a more beautiful book and a better book, so that it's more rhetorical, I would say, in terms of I mean, always the same kind of questions: how to be a good courtier, how to please the king, and this kind of stuff. And I don't know where epistemic questions regarding typography would raise in the academy. I'd say I don't mean that that it cannot be the case. It's just not the case here, and it's. About the emblematic view, I think we can say at this stage, in this context, that it's completely over, almost. I mean, it's very different from the context of the Royal Society, where almost everybody has kind of alchemical or biblical dreams, or I mean, I'm a bit, or you know, this kind of research is. But what I have in mind is that at the same moment there was a lot of work that were done for Louis XIV, including things about not emblems, but what we call in French devices, and in these kind of specific kind of emblems, the natural world is very is here. So but the way they deal with this is very different from the way naturalists in the Academie works. And actually, you can see that there is a kind of different worldview, if I may say, at this point between the guys that are working on emblems and the guys in the Academie that are working on animals. So I don't know, does it answer your
disagree, but that's
yeah. I have quite many people on the list, 6 people, and we have short time. So I'll call people. I'm not sure I have time for everyone, but I've asked people to ask shortly and for you to answer shortly.
Yeah.
Menachem, please.
Thanks for a fabulous case study. I think you sell really Daston and Peter a little cheap. It's a profound one, but we shan't go into that. I'd like to talk to you about the book itself. The true nature paradigm harks back, and I'm sure you agree, to the old Protestant conceit of a tabula rasa. You know, clear your mind of concepts, and then you'll see nature and therefore the division of labor between an ignorant, the scientifically ignorant yet talented draftsman, and so on and so forth, which is of course a myth. Now, the interesting thing is that the master draftsman of all time, Leonardo da Vinci drafted dissections, and according to Vesalius and Gallay, the theory was that the male penis has two ducts, one for sperm and one for urine. And he dissected the penis and drew two ducts. That's what he saw. Now, this would have been a curious curiosity unless it caused havoc in Jewish law, in halakha, because there's a whole set of issues about the ducts of the penis, and the rabbis, and then they found that there was no such thing, right? It was only one. So, but of course the rabbis couldn't be wrong, and therefore they pointed to Da Vinci's painting in order to prove that nature had changed. It's unbelievable. But that's what. So this die-hard notion of a sort of bare empiricism dies out at that turn of objectivity. You know, that's the beginning of the wake-up call. There's an interesting analogy with the observers of astronomers, which again, who were ignorant scientifically. All you needed to do was to calibrate their eyes with the personal equation, right? And they saw and weren't blinded or by theory and saw nature for what it was, and you know, they drew that as a diagram. But from that point of view, it's a fascinating moment in the history and philosophy of science. And great case study. So, no question here, just.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antoine. I'll try to be very brief and just crazy. First of all, let me say that having worked on those sources, I hope people realize how much labor it takes just to reconstruct everything in the mess that is the drawings in the Archive de l'Académie des Sciences. So that's great. And I think that following on Menachem's point, that taking into account the empirical division of labor in the Académie des Sciences, and not just ideas about the division of labor, is an actual crucial contribution. So I'm all for it. And my question is, I'd like to raise two issues that relate to what you're saying about, you know, we can talk later about lots of different details, but I think there are two crucial issues about the way you interpret Dastan and Gallay's here. The first being is that the Académie des Sciences in this project, well, the idea of truth to nature is about ideally a draftsman using his knowledge to overcome all the particular flaws in a particular specimen and then drawing up the ideal type. But the Académie des Sciences, and I think also the Royal Society here, are very much committed to the idea of using specimens and not species here, because in the French case, it's about showing the strength of Louis XIV and bringing those exotic animals to France. And in the Lebanon quote, which is absolutely amazing, it's also about people interested in the particulars and not in the universals. So I think the way the material connects to the argument can be stronger here. And also in a second sense, I think that atlases are important for them because they're an important pedagogical tool for actually teaching people to internalize epistemological virtues. This is, I think, probably completely non-existent in the natural history projects, which are basically diplomatic gifts, and the third volume is never printed in the 17th century. It's really not about pedagogy. And since nobody is supposed to internalize anything based on it, I'm just, I would be less surprised to see differences between Perrault and Duvernay in the way that they relate to the broad argument about the importance of images for instilling epistemic virtues. So those are really two things where I think you can nuance and improve, even though you know not about nuance. It's about the way you can improve the critique and the contribution of looking at the empirical division of labor into the broad arguments about objectivity and the role of visual culture.
Well, thank you very much. So the question of, to answer your try to answer very quickly the 2 points. So the question of what do Dastan and Gallay understand by truth to nature.
What they tell, not what they understand.
Yeah, but I mean, so maybe one of my points is to forget a bit what they tell and to try to figure out what we can, the way we can use it. And the fact that, of course, the idea of having the idea of the type being so important for them in the truth to nature paradigm, the case of the animal project is very problematic. It doesn't fit. But if you think truth to nature in broader, which is what I try to do, and maybe it's a bit of over-interpretation, but when you think truth to nature as a way, as the ability, as the value, as the valuation of the ability of this man of science to understand what he sees and to be able to represent the thing in its truth beyond the appearances, but not necessarily regarding the peculiar case of species, but in general. I would say one of the, I'm also working on another, I'm going to do a long answer, but I'll try to. But I'm also working on a very interesting object, which is a map of the moon. And the moon, you have when you try to represent the moon, of course, there is no question of type, or it's just one moon, but you still have the same kind of issue. To what extent the draughtsman or the scholar, I mean, represent things as he thinks they are, and it's I think it's striking with Evelius' case that I just showed earlier, where actually Evelius is in a kind of enlarged truth to nature paradigm in the way he, and I mean, he projects what he knows onto the picture. So yeah, to make it short, and the second point.
Okay, we have a few more, but I'll let Slate have the last point, and then the other will have to give the points in the bar together. So.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a question which now, given the time, I don't know if you can answer them. I have a few questions given the time, the short of the time, I don't know if you can answer them. The first is whether you have considered looking at the work of draftsmen not as isolated in relation to scientists who work for the Royal Academy, but as there is a continuum of illustrations of various kinds of animals and of humans in the 17th and 18th century. Animals, plants, humans of the natural world that come out and pretend to be true to nature in travel books, in botany, in animal atlases. And there is a continuum of these illustrations. And there is a continuum in the pretension of being true to nature. So I don't know if by isolating a particular case of relations between scientists and Royal Academy at a particular point of time, you are actually ignoring conventions of representation and conventions of being true to nature, and the changes of both levels of conventions, both the convention of representation and the convention of being true to nature in a variety of fields, and the changes happen more or less concurrently. So therefore, I think looking at this very, very tiny piece, which is important, but it's part of a continuum, I think something is getting lost. That's one question. The other question is, in terms of the stage in which illustration comes into the research. When does the illustration become important? At the end of the research, the beginning of the research is different with animals than with plants. For example, L'Amour in the 18th century thought it's crucial. Linnaeus, who couldn't draw, thought he doesn't need it. So, and they both are early 18th century. So the question, where then, when does this element of drawing comes in, is important for the picture of not only how you present nature in illustrations, but why is illustration important in scientific research?
Thank you very much for two very huge questions. For regarding the first one, of course, there might be some loss but what I'm trying to do is not to forget what is enduring during the conventions that are still there and are also related to many other fields than natural history. For example, I mean, there are very close connection between the Academie and all the kind of representations of animals that are made, for example, for paintings or tapestries or these kind of things that are
journeys. Or in journeys.
Yeah.
Organized journeys.
Yeah, all of this is connected, but within this kind of flow continuum of conventions. I mean, I think we can still try to see what the tiny stuff where there are differences and try precisely not to forget the remaining conventions that are maybe the largest parts, but still try to understand how things change, and that I think that's the main way. But I should be careful about not forgetting the wider conventions, of course. And regarding the second question is, I try to memorize, but I forget the
when does
yeah.
illustration
come
into the research? What stage of the research, and when is it important, and when it loses its importance?
Well, the question, it depends if you're talking about history, large history, or within
17, early 18th century.
But do you want to know when in the history it happens, or during every processes when it?
Yeah, in the research, when is the illustration crucial, and when it is just something that comes after the fact?
Yeah.
That's more in which cases, I guess, than when. It's in which cases. That's the. So it's more. I think we can leave it like that, because the question is really just. It's more. If I understood correctly, it's more the question of in which of these cases, in which other cases, you see the figure as part of the research or as the end result. In which kind of part?
There's a process in which it becomes less and less important. So the question is, when is it really important?
When is it a tool and when is it an illustration?
Yeah.
It's not binary.
but basically in both cases they are tools. I mean, when Perrault begins to do his sketch just because he need to have sketches because he cannot write everything, and for Duvernay it's real tools because they are supposed to be used by naturalists then, instead of looking at so there is also this question of variation. I mean, it's not just there are illustration or tools, but the degree of utility they can have, I think, but I'm happy to discuss later.
Okay, thank you very much for Antoine for the introduction. Here, so you can continue talking with him. I will be happy to do that, and you are all invited always to the Chuk HaTzfoni, to the tap nearby, and have a drink on the house or on the.